So as I said, let me begin with an introduction. Philosophers generally regard impairment and disability as naturally disadvantageous human characteristics or properties that certain people embody or possess. That is, generally regard impairment and disability as self-evident, naturally occurring, and politically neutral phenomena. In recent years, however, some philosophers have challenged this individualized, naturalized, and medicalized understanding of disability, helping to consolidate an area of philosophy that I initiated and for which I coined the name philosophy of disability. For example, some of these philosophers assume the tenets of a dominant model of disability, namely the British social model of disability, arguing that although impairments are prediscursive and thus politically neutral human characteristics, disability is a pervasive form of social disadvantage imposed upon people with impairments. As I have pointed out in various contexts, the British social model of disability is structurally analogous to both the feminist sex-gender distinction and its predecessor, Claude Lévi-Strauss's nature-culture distinction. Like feminists who challenge the prediscursive and thus universal status conferred upon the category of sex in the sex-gender distinction, and the category of nature in the nature-culture distinction, I have worked to denaturalize impairment, the putatively prediscursive foundation of the British social model's impairment-disability distinction. In Foucault and Feminist Philosophy of Disability, the book that was mentioned that I published in 2017, and in numerous articles, I argue, contra the British social model, that both impairment and disability are socially constructed, invented rather than discovered, made rather than found. I've argued, in short, that disability is constructed all the way down as a dispositif, to use Michel Foucault's term, a complex apparatus of force relations that produces impairment as the naturally disadvantageous foundation of disability in order to camouflage its own thoroughly political motivation. An aim of my research is therefore to indicate how this apparatus of power, that is the apparatus of disability, has been naturalized within philosophy to bring impairment into being as that sort of thing. Indeed, my work amounts to a call for a conceptual revolution with regard to what philosophers currently think disability is and what their current thinking about disability does. Among the questions that my research implicitly and explicitly asks are these. How has philosophy construed disability and its naturalized antecedent impairment as a certain kind of problem for the present, and in doing so, propped up the apparatus of disability? What is the relation between this conceptualization of disability as a problem that ought to be resolved, what is taught about disability in philosophy, and the underrepresentation of disabled philosophers in the profession? My presentation today will provide a snapshot of my work on both the problematization and naturalization of disability in philosophy. I will pay particular attention to how an individualized and medicalized conception of disability is naturalized in feminist philosophy. Throughout the presentation, I will offer examples of how disabled people are represented in philosophical discourse as a problem to be rectified, if not eliminated, and explain how the prevalence of this individualized and medicalized understanding of disability in philosophy, which the apparatus of disability fosters, contributes to and reinforces the exclusion of disabled philosophers from the profession of philosophy. I will end the presentation with remarks about how the individualized and medicalized conception of disability conditions current philosophical and popular responses to the predictable COVID-19 tragedy that has unfolded in nursing homes and other institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are confined, offering an alternative to the way that most bioethicists and proponents of care ethics represent this grievous state of affairs. Naturalization of disability in philosophy is a form of structural gaslighting. Nora Berenstain defines structural gaslighting as, and I quote, any conceptual work that functions to obscure the non-accidental connections between structures of oppression and the patterns of harm that they produce and license, end quote. Structural gaslighting, Berenstain explains, involves the employment of epistemologies and ideologies of domination that obscure or distort the actual causes, mechanisms, strategies, and effects of oppression. My argument is that the epistemologies and ontologies of domination that persistently naturalize disability in philosophy systematically sabotage attempts to improve the situation and status of disabled philosophers, in part because these epistemologies and ontologies facilitate the reconstitution within both the discipline and profession of deeply entrenched beliefs according to which disabled people are defective, unreliable, and suboptimal, and thus not viable colleagues. The research has developed in two distinct but inseparable spheres. In the reconstructive conceptual sphere of my research, I've endeavored to show how disability is naturalized in philosophy as a non-accidental and disadvantageous biological human characteristic, property, attribute, etc., that ought to be corrected or eliminated. That is how disability is individualized and medicalized in, for instance, bioethics, cognitive science, feminist philosophy, and political philosophy. In this sphere of my research, I've also articulated an alternative conception of disability that construes it as an apparatus in Foucault's sense. That is, as an ensemble of discourses, institutions, scientific statements, laws, administrative measures, and philosophical and moral propositions that responds to an urgent need in a given historical moment. My argument is that biopolitical normalization is the urgent requirement in response to which strategies, mechanisms, and technologies of the apparatus of disability have hitherto emerged, that is, in this historical moment. In the other sphere of my research, that is the metaphilosophical sphere, I've used empirical data and theoretical argument to identify and interrogate mechanisms and practices within the profession of philosophy that produce the underrepresentation of disabled philosophers and the marginalization of critical philosophical work on disability. Given that a medicalized and individualized conception of disability is widely assumed in philosophy, Philosophers generally do not regard disability as pertinent to inquiry in social metaphysics, political philosophy, and feminist philosophy, among other subfields. Rather, philosophers are taught as students that disability is appropriately and adequately addressed in the domains of medicine, science, and bioethics, and in most cases go on to themselves subsequently teach that disability is most pertinent to these domains. One of the aims of my work is to demonstrate that ontology and politics are always already intertwined, that is, mutually constitutive and mutually reinforcing. I want to underscore, therefore, that the assumptions about disability that currently condition conceptual and analytical work in the discipline, assumptions according to which disability is a disadvantageous personal characteristic or misfortune, also condition the judgments that philosophers make about, for instance, graduate school applications, faculty searches and hiring practices, and tenure and promotion. In other words, the prevalence in philosophy of the seemingly self-evident assumption that disability is a natural disadvantage, best addressed in bioethical and biomedical contexts, has feedback effects for the careers of disabled philosophers and disabled philosophers of disability in particular, for the composition of the profession, and for the very content of the discipline. In short, the predominance in philosophy of an individualized and medicalized understanding of disability is co-constitutive with the exclusion of disabled philosophers from employment in the profession, contributing to the continued marginalization of philosophy of disability in the discipline. Indeed, the role that the subfield of bioethics plays in the exclusion of both disabled philosophers and critical philosophical work on disability cannot be overstated. So the next section is entitled Genealogy as a Practice of Denaturalization. Genealogy is, I would argue, the most effective philosophical practice with which to uncover the historical contingency of identities, states of affairs, and other phenomena that are taken to be necessary, natural, and thus politically neutral and transhistorical. Genealogy can, furthermore, reveal how certain domains and subfields of philosophy, such as bioethics, have emerged and been configured in ways that reproduce the naturalization and biologization of disability and its alleged foundation impairment. For example, genealogy can identify how the pathologization of Phineas Gage since the mid-19th century has enabled the emergence and consolidation of the fields of cognitive science and neuroscience, as well as the emergence in these domains of arguments according to which brain injury is a self-evidently biological and value-neutral phenomenon. In 1848, Gage, a railroad supervisor, was impaled by a tamping iron that entered his left cheek and exited the back of his skull. Over the course of more than a century and a half, an almost mythical narrative has been elaborated within psychology and medical textbooks about the aftermath of Gage's injury, a mythology to which philosophers and cognitive scientists have subscribed and upon which they have expanded. As Alan Roper, a neurologist at Harvard Medical School puts it, Gage's famous case helped to establish brain science as a field. Roper explains that Gage's brain injury offered scientists and medical practitioners an ideal case because it involved one region of the brain, was very evident, and the resulting changes in personality were quote unquote stunning. Notwithstanding the contested status of assumptions about the modularity of the brain, these sorts of claims about the impact of Gage's injury have led philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists to use the story of Gage as a springboard to formulate positions on, among other things, personal identity, the true self, and the moral self. My argument is, however, that the uses to which philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists have increasingly put the story of Gage naturalize the phenomenon of brain injury and are highly contestable. Simultaneously contributing to the social significance attributed to brain injury and tendentiously isolating brain injury from the social, cultural, and political contexts in which it is embedded and in which its significance is materialized. Steve Toomey notes that, and I quote, John Martin Harlow, the doctor who treated Gage for a few months after the incident, reported that Gage's friends found him no longer Gage, end quote. To Harlow, Toomey remarks, and I quote again, the balance between Gage's intellectual faculties and animal propensities seemed to have disappeared. Gage was unable to stick to plans, uttered the grossest profanity, and showed little deference for his fellows, end quote. In an odd kind of fame, Stories of Phineas Gage, Malcolm Macmillan points out that subsequent accounts of Gage's changed character have gone far beyond Harlow's dubious initial observations, transforming Gage into quote unquote an ill-tempered, shiftless drunk, end quote. My research on Gage has convinced me that these accounts about Gage's demeanor post-incident have been exaggerated and in fact seem largely fabricated. Consider, if you will, that Harlow, to whom most of the relevant medical, scientific, and philosophical literature appeals, treated and observed Gage for only a few months, a relatively short span of time, given Gage's injury and the changes in his life that it would have entailed. Indeed, Harlow's description of the post-incident Gage does not warrant the dispositional and personality changes, cruel, mean, abusive, and violent, that had been attributed to Gage in the scientific, psychological, and philosophical literature over the years. That Gage's situation has been exaggerated and embellished within the context of neuroscience, psychology, philosophy of mind, experimental philosophy, and medicine reminds us that science, philosophy, and medicine are embedded social practices rather than disinterested domains that exist apart from and unsullied by ableist biases and other elements of the apparatus of disability. The uses to which philosophers have put the Gage case and their implicit and explicit rationale and justifications for continuing to do so are clear and distinct examples of how the political causes and effects of philosophical inquiry are persistently neutralized, covering over the situated character of the context of discovery from which philosophical questions emerge and presenting them as objective, value neutral, and disinterested. Thus, I can contend that we should ask the following questions about the growth of this line of inquiry in philosophy of mind, experimental philosophy, cognitive science, and related fields. First, how has this embellished historical narrative about Gage contributed to the problematization of disability in philosophy? Second, in what ways has this mythical narrative about Gage enabled the naturalization and materialization of impairment within certain fields of the discipline, and thus further enabled the consolidation of the relationship between philosophy and the apparatus of disability? In what ways does this mythology about certain disabled people ultimately shape, condition, and determine research programs and teaching in cognitive science, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind? And finally, to what extent does the repeated articulation of this fanciful narrative about Gage foster the hostile environment that disabled philosophers confront in philosophy, sustaining their underrepresentation in it? In Foucault's work on the history of the modern prison and the history of sexuality, he adapted the genealogical method that Friedrich Nietzsche famously introduced in studies of the descent of Western morals, variously referring to his own incarnations of genealogy as histories of the present and historical ontologies of ourselves. For Foucault, the genealogist asks, of what is given to us as universal, necessary, and obligatory, how much is occupied by the singular, the contingent, the product of arbitrary constraints? Foucault used genealogy to critically inquire into the history of necessity on a given topic and the historical emergence of the necessary conditions of a certain state of affairs, pointing out that a critical ontology of ourselves must not be considered as a theory, doctrine, or permanent body of knowledge, but rather as a limit attitude, that is, as an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is at the same time the historical analysis of the limits imposed on us. In other words, genealogy identifies how historically contingent practices and events have enabled the emergence of current modes of thinking and acting and the limits that they impose. Genealogy is thus especially apt for an examination of the ways that disability is naturalized in philosophy. For example, one can use genealogy to trace the emergence of modern notions of normality within philosophy of science and the role that these historical artifacts have played in the constitution of disability within philosophy of science, including in feminist philosophy of science. As Foucault remarked, genealogies are not positivistic returns to a form of science that more accurately represent phenomena. Rather, genealogies are anti-sciences. Genealogy is, and I quote, an attempt to desubjugate historical knowledges, to enable them to oppose and struggle against the coercion of a unitary, formal, and scientific theoretical discourse, end quote. Hence, genealogies require the excavation and articulation of subjugated knowledges, knowledges that have, and I quote, been disqualified as inadequate to their task or insufficiently elaborated, naive knowledges located low down on the hierarchy beneath the required level of cognition or scientificity, end quote. Historical ontologies, that is, genealogies, exhume these phenomena, these subjugated knowledges, in order that the historically contingent character of the self-understandings and self-perceptions that we hold in the present can be more readily understood. Entitled the next section, How Disability is Naturalized in feminist philosophy. Few feminist philosophers have challenged, oops, I think I've mixed up I think one of my slides has been deleted, I'm sorry. Few feminist philosophers have challenged the alleged self-evidence of accepted philosophical and scientific assumptions about the putatively natural character of disability, nor have more than a few feminist philosophers of science made noticeable efforts to incorporate philosophy of disability and the subjugated knowledges of disabled people into their analyses of science, their critiques of mainstream philosophy of science, or into their feminist philosophy of science itself. Hence, I have aimed to correct the omission of feminist philosophy of disability from feminist philosophy of science and feminist philosophy more generally by offering a cutting-edge genealogical understanding of disability that denaturalizes it. That is, a historicist understanding of disability that feminist philosophers of science and feminist philosophers in general can fold into their research and teaching, thereby increasing the likelihood that philosophy of disability will play a more formative role in shaping the future of feminist philosophy than it does at the present. To motivate these interventions, I've drawn upon insights that Foucault introduced in his critical ontologies of abnormality, perversion, madness, and other discursive objects that are commonly associated with disability. My interventions suggest ways in which feminist philosophers can extend the inquiries that Foucault made in these critical ontologies, and therefore might be aptly characterized as feminist philosophical treatises on what he referred to as the problematization of phenomena in the present, that is, characterized as elements of a critical feminist ontology of the problematization of disability. Foucault's critical ontologies of abnormality, perversion, madness, and other phenomena were designed to uncover how these phenomena became thinkable, that is, how they emerged as problems to which solutions were produced. Following Foucault, my examination of the naturalization of disability has been designed to accomplish these aims, among others. And this is the slide. First, persuade feminists and other philosophers that a historically contingent and culturally specific regime of power, namely biopower, has constituted certain acts, practices, subjectivities, bodies, relations, and so on as a problem for the present. Second, convince feminist philosophers that philosophy has played and continues to play a considerable role in the elaboration of this problem. And third, point out to feminist philosophers that in all likelihood, their own theoretical analyses and discursive practices contribute to the persistence in philosophy of the simultaneous problematization of disability and exclusion of critical philosophical work about disability. The persisting problematization and naturalization of disability in feminist philosophy may seem puzzling, given how much work feminist philosophers have done to denaturalize and debiologize other social categories, such as sex, gender, and sexuality. With some of the most powerful feminist arguments to denaturalize sex and gender articulated by feminist philosophers of science themselves. Indeed, feminist philosophy of science emerged in large part as a critical response to the essentialist assumptions about sex and gender that continue to both limit the kinds of questions that mainstream scientists and philosophers of science regard as worthy of investigation, and circumscribe the kinds of responses to these questions that they will seriously consider. Thus, feminist scientists and feminist philosophers of science have thrown into relief the biased nature of taken for granted assumptions about reproductive processes, undermine the gendering of the brain, and subverting the very idea of two natural binary sexes. Some of the earliest work that feminist philosophers of science designed to denaturalize and debiologize sex and gender made associations between essentialist arguments about sex and gender and, among other things, degradation of the environment, subjugation of non-human animals, and colonial projects worldwide. I want to point out, however, that although some feminist philosophers of science have not confined themselves solely to critique of the assumptions that underpin traditional philosophical and scientific claims about sex and gender, urgent questions and concerns about disability, race, indigeneity, and settler colonialism, among other things, nevertheless remain sidelined in feminist philosophy of science and feminist philosophy more generally. An example of the problematization and naturalization of disability in feminist philosophical context can be found in Perfect Me, Beauty as an Ethical Ideal, feminist philosopher and bioethicist Heather Widdows' recent book on the ethics of feminine beauty standards. The central thesis of the book is that norms with respect to beauty and appearance more generally are social constructs, never ethically nor politically neutral, always value-laden. Yet the brief remarks that Widdows makes about disability in Perfect Me undermine these claims, and I would argue the overall argument of the book, as well as reproduce an individualized and medicalized conception of disability in feminist philosophy and philosophical bioethics. Although Widdows' explicit remarks about disability span only a page and a half of her 341-page book, notions that rely upon individualized and medicalized conceptions of normality and disability, such as notions of healthy functioning, disorder, risk, abnormal bodies, and suffering, pepper the analysis of beauty throughout the book. I surmise that Widdows' training in and implicit allegiance to analytic philosophy, and in particular analytic bioethics, likely precluded from her discussion opportunities for extended critical analysis of disability and of the relations between normality, normalization, beauty, and disability. Were Widdows to have engaged with, for instance, my work on disability and normality and the incremental normalization of force relations that neoliberal bioethics enables, she might have recognized how the genealogies of impairment, normality, and normalization that I have provided undercut the outdated claims about disability that she ultimately makes in her book, claims that variously serve to renaturalize and remedicalize the apparatus of disability, and that hence run counter to some of the most philosophically and politically perspicacious work currently done in philosophy and theory of disability. In Foucaultian feminist philosophy of disability and elsewhere, I advance arguments according to which the ideas of normality and impairment should be regarded as artifactual mechanisms and effects of biopower, which is a complicated matrix of social power relations that facilitates population management and control in the service of neoliberalism. I have asserted, furthermore, that the most effective and philosophically tenable way to throw into relief the artifactual and contingent character of normality or any other seemingly natural and objective practice, state of affairs, identity, and value is to trace its genealogy. That is, genealogy is the most effective way to trace the historical accidents and contingent circumstances from which normality or any other putatively prediscursive value, practice, state of affairs, or identity emerged. I've also asserted that Foucault's work demonstrates how feminist philosophers can advance a philosophically up-to-date critique of the naturalization and biologization of disability that avoids spurious appeals to ideology. If, as I've argued, widows were to have consistently drawn upon Foucault's insights throughout her book, she would likely not have taken argumentative recourse to contestable ideas about ideology and historically specific notions of normality. Insofar as feminist bioethicists, philosophers of medicine, and cognitive scientists, among others, assume individualized and medicalized conceptions of disability, they take for granted that the social disadvantages that disabled people confront are the inevitable consequences of natural, that is, biological and physiological disadvantages that should be prevented, eliminated from the human gene pool, and cured through scientific and technological discovery and medical intervention. Indeed, most feminist philosophers uncritically and implicitly accept the aforementioned assumptions about what disability is, though they may not derive the same normative conclusions from this ontology as mainstream philosophers do. Even most philosophers of disability do not rigorously question the metaphysical and epistemological status of disability, but rather advance ethical and political positions that largely assume the self-evidence of that status. That this cluster of assumptions is contestable, that it might be the case that disability is a historically and culturally specific and contingent social phenomenon, a complex apparatus of power, rather than a natural attribute or property that certain people possess, is not considered, let alone seriously entertained. An astute feminist philosophy would denaturalize and debiologize disability by arguing that disability is a historical artifact, drawing upon Foucault's insights to do so. As I have indicated, I recommend that feminist philosophers adopt Foucault's idea of an apparatus to argue that disability is a historically specific and dispersed system of force relations that produces and configures practices towards certain strategic and political ends. As an apparatus, disability is a historically contingent aggregate that comprises a complex and complicated set of discourses, technologies, identities, and practices that emerge from medical and scientific research, government policies and administrative decisions, academic initiatives, activism, art, literature, mainstream popular culture, and so on. Although some of the diverse elements of the apparatus of disability seem to have different and even conflicting aims, design strategies, and techniques of application, the elements of the apparatus are nevertheless co-constitutive and mutually reinforcing. The apparatus of disability is expansive and expanding, differentially subjecting people on the basis of constructed perceptions and interpretations of, for instance, bodily structure, appearance, style and pace of motility, mode of communication, emotional expression, size, mode of food intake, and cognitive character, all of which phenomena are produced and understood within a culturally and historically contingent frame and shaped by place of birth, place of residence, gender, education, religion, years lived, and so on. Philosophical analysis that understands disability as an apparatus treats these phenomena as the outcomes of contextually specific and performative relations of biopower, rather than as transcultural and transhistorical, objective and determined facts about humans. Biopower, Foucault wrote, and I quote, is what brought life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations and made knowledge, power, an agent of transformation of human life, end quote. Foucault used the term biopower to refer to the convergences of these immanent strategies and techniques for population management from the 18th century onward. Biopower, Foucault remarked, is, and I quote again, the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power, or how, starting from the 18th century, modern Western societies took on board the fundamental biological fact that human beings are a species. Sex, Foucault pointed out, has been central to the economic and political problem of population that emerged with biopower and to which biopolitical strategies have responded. That is, with the emergence of biopower came the problematization of sex, including surveillance practices and policies designed to manage relations between two supposedly natural sexes, birth rates, fecundity, so-called miscegenation, sexual practices, and so on. As with the apparatus of sex, so too with the apparatus of disability, a whole array of scientific, administrative, and social techniques and strategies have emerged within the apparatus of disability to calculate and manage the ostensibly natural embodiment and experience of disability. In short, the conception of disability as an apparatus that I have developed does not rely upon some variation of the assumption that impairment and disability could be taken up as politically neutral and value neutral objects of inquiry, were it not for disabling practices and policies of exclusion that the ideological requirements of power place upon them. This assumption is, however, fundamental to the British social model of disability, which construes impairment as a politically neutral and value neutral human characteristic or trait on which disability construed, as I have argued, construed as social oppression is imposed. With the conception of disability as an apparatus, no domain of impairment or disability exists apart from relations of power. That is, there's no politically neutral or value neutral description or definition of impairment and disability. Impairment and disability can never be freed from power, nor furthermore can there be a phenomenology that articulates these supposedly prediscursive domains. On the Foucauldian understanding of disability that I have developed, power relations are neither external to impairment and external to impairment and disability, nor external to their nexus in the apparatus of disability, but rather are integral to this relationship, constituting the knowledge and objects that these historical artifacts affect, as well as the artifacts themselves. The final section of my presentation I've entitled The Apparatus of Disability and the Nursing Home Industrial Complex. My efforts to denaturalize disability presuppose certain assumptions about the relationship between biology and society, while rejecting certain other assumptions about this relationship between nature and nurture, as it is often called. African-American feminist legal scholar and sociologist Dorothy Roberts has schematized assumptions about the relationship between nature and nurture by vividly describing two approaches to inquiry in the social sciences, which she refers to as the old biosocial science and the new biosocial science. Roberts notes that the old way of doing biosocial science posits that biological differences produce social inequality, whereas the new way of doing biosocial science posits that social inequality produces biological differences. Roberts explains that the biological determinism of the former approach, that is the old biosocial science, is achieved in several ways. First, nature is separated from nurture, and the origins of social inequalities are located in inherent human traits. Second, the old biosocial science postulates that social inequalities are reproduced in the bodies of socially disadvantaged people. And third, problems that stem from social inequality are claimed to derive from the threats that oppressed people's biology itself poses to society. And finally, the old biosocial science endeavors to intervene and fix perceived biological deficits of oppressed people rather than end the structural violence that dehumanizes them and maintains an unjust social order. Roberts, whose own position on human biology is non-essentialist and constructivist, writes that, by contrast, the new way of doing biosocial science posits that every single biological element, every single biological process in the human body, every human cell, and everything that happens to a human cell is affected by society. In short, all of life is both biological and social. There is, in short, Roberts notes, no natural body. Biology is not a separate entity that interacts with the environment. Rather, these interactions constitute biology. With Roberts, I maintain that critical analyses of biosocial science must consider how claims about biological phenomena are produced, in what context these claims are mobilized, and for what political purposes. In this last section of my presentation, therefore, I point out how disability is naturalized and depoliticized in care discourses about COVID-19 and institutions such as nursing homes in which elders and younger disabled people are segregated. In addition, I argue that philosophers must engage in radical conceptual engineering that construes these institutions as elements of the nursing home industrial complex, as I refer to it. Philosophers have largely ignored the social, economic, and political circumstances that surround nursing homes and other congregate settings in which elders and younger disabled people are put, preferring to understand these settings as politically neutral sites of care, love, and benevolence, rather than understand them as carceral environments that enabled the segregation and management of certain populations deemed to be disposable. According to a New York Times report, 479,000 residents and staff of 19,000 American nursing homes and so-called long-term care facilities were infected with COVID-19 by mid-September 2020, while more than 77,000 residents and staff of these institutions had by mid-September 2020 died of the coronavirus. Residents and staff of nursing homes located in predominantly Black neighborhoods in US cities were disproportionately represented among these fatalities. By October 27, 2020, 84,136 COVID-19 deaths had occurred in nursing homes in the United States, and 537,446 COVID-19 cases were recorded in these institutions, figures that do not account for the COVID-19 deaths and cases in US group homes, psychiatric hospitals, and other institutions in which elders and disabled people live. More than a year later, the death toll in these places is much higher. Nevertheless, philosophers have had little to say about these institutional deaths and the conditions under which they occurred. Philosophers, including feminist philosophers, seem to have largely taken for granted that these cases and deaths are attributable to a natural property or characteristic inherent to these older and disabled populations. Hence, these deaths, philosophers seem to imply, are in some sense unavoidable and thus are neither ethically nor politically troubling. Not even philosophers who advance proposals about how society should respond to COVID-19 interrogate the relationship between the outbreaks in these institutions and the character of the institutions themselves. This refusal on the part of philosophers to closely examine the social, economic, and political circumstances in which these coronavirus cases and deaths have occurred has enabled the ageist, ableist, classist, and racist conditions that precipitated these fatalities to remain obscured and unchallenged, including the neoliberal socio-economic conditions that made possible the very existence of the institutions. Hence, I have called upon philosophers to pursue a form of conceptual engineering with respect to nursing homes. That is, to acknowledge that nursing homes, so-called long-term care facilities, group homes, and other institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are confined, constitute the fulcrum of a massive network of governmentality, a network of governmentality that I refer to as the nursing home industrial complex. This revision of our perceptions and understandings of nursing homes and their functions could be described as a process of semantic amelioration. Semantic amelioration, as Shelley defines it, involves the expansion and improvement of the resources available to us with which to understand phenomena. To illustrate this definition, Haslanger points to the movement from an understanding of the concept of race as a biological kind to an understanding of the concept of race as a socio-historical kind. Haslanger notes that the distinct conceptual schemas available in the respective historical milieus in which these disparate understandings of the metaphysical status of race circulated have conditioned divergent understandings of the concept of race. In my own terms of reference, I argue that the conceptual schema which currently conditions perceptions and understandings of nursing homes and other congregate settings in which elders and younger disabled people are confined is a historically contingent mechanism of the apparatus of disability. That is, the conceptual schema that construes these institutions as paradigmatic sites of care and love, rather than as the linchpin of an industrial complex of governmentality, is an artifact of the apparatus of disability and other apparatuses of power with which disability is entwined. The idea of an industrial complex has a distinctly American lineage with multilateral implications. In 1961, during a televised speech broadcast into the living rooms of a predominantly white middle-class America, President Dwight D. Eisenhower introduced the idea of an industrial complex by invoking the term military industrial complex. Eisenhower's use of the term military industrial complex was intended to warn this sector of the American public about, and I quote, the unprecedented conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry, end quote. Eisenhower was especially concerned about the potential of the arms industry to influence government policies and budgets, that is, concerned about the potential of arms manufacturers to coerce the US government to finance military aggressions abroad in order to serve their own economic interests. In other words, Eisenhower coined the term military industrial complex to articulate this concern, that the more money that could potentially be made at home from military aggressions abroad, the more that military aggressions abroad would be made. And the more money at home and wars abroad that were made, the more influence that American manufacturers of military-related items, such as bombs, jets, and uniforms, could wield over elected US government officials in the states in which the items would be produced. After Eisenhower, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and others introduced the term prison industrial complex to describe the system through which prisons have become a mechanism of racial segregation in the United States and a primary source of profits for many American manufacturers and multilateral corporations. Likewise, I use the term nursing home industrial complex to refer to an expansive economic network that comprises nursing homes and other so-called care facilities, medical clothing and linen suppliers, healthcare and administrative temp agencies, professional associations, prepared food companies, medical equipment manufacturers, pharmaceutical corporations, and other entities that benefit economically from the segregation of elder and disabled populations in nursing homes, assisted living centers, and other congregate settings. In short, the nursing home industrial complex has increasingly come to hold the coercive economic influence over elected officials about which Eisenhower had forewarned. For example, the term nursing home industrial complex aptly describes the relationship between the American nursing home industry and US politicians, as was starkly evident when, in the summer of election year 2020, US Senator Mitch McConnell initiated legislation that would grant legal immunity to the owners of American nursing homes for liability related to COVID-19 deaths and any other fatalities that occur on their premises. Nevertheless, as a mechanism of the apparatus of disability and ultimately neoliberalism, the nursing home industrial complex extends far beyond the borders of the United States, with the nursing home industry an integral part of the economies of Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Hong Kong, Italy, South Africa, South Korea, Sweden, and the UK, seeking new markets in Latin America, the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere. Since early March 2020, discourses about COVID-19 cases and deaths in Canadian nursing homes and other congregate settings where elders and disabled people are put have unraveled in the mainstream press in Canada and on social media. In the terms of these discourses, the COVID-19 cases and deaths in these institutions, which account for more than 3/4 of the total number of COVID-19 deaths in Canada, had been largely naturalized and medicalized due to their age or an apparently, had been largely naturalized and medicalized, represented as an inevitable consequence of a vulnerability inherent to the residents of the institutions due to their age or an apparently intrinsic characteristic, now commonly referred to as an underlying condition, or in more technical terms, a comorbidity. Seldom has the succession of COVID-19 outbreaks in Canadian nursing homes and other institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are placed being attributed to the very nature and functioning of the institutions themselves. Nevertheless, the outbreaks that continue to occur in nursing homes and similar congregate settings across Canada and indeed globally are not due to an inherent characteristic of elders and disabled people, that is, are not due to some inherent vulnerability of the elder and disabled populations who live in these institutions that better funding and staffing would manage and control. On the contrary, the thousands of COVID-19 cases and deaths in nursing homes and other so-called long-term care institutions across the world, like the thousands of COVID-19 cases and deaths in prisons, are testament to the insidious nature of the institutions themselves and the dehumanizing and outdated roles that they continue to serve in our societies. Indeed, COVID-19 has thrown into relief that nursing homes and so-called long-term care facilities like prisons must be abolished. That is, both the nursing home industrial complex and the prison industrial complex must be dismantled. Many feminist philosophers have worked to redeem the allegedly self-evident and prediscursive status that has customarily been ascribed to vulnerability and simultaneously disparaged. However, the apparent self-evidence of the ontological status of vulnerability is an artifact of structural gaslighting. Hence, the concept of vulnerability too should be the target of a feminist project of conceptual engineering. Rather than a prediscursive and inherent human trait, vulnerability is a contextually specific social phenomenon whose politically potent and artifactual character could be recognized and acknowledged if feminist philosophers, among others, were to take up Foucault's idea of eventualization. Foucault used the term eventualization to refer to a procedure of analysis that amounts to a breach of self-evidence. Eventualization aims to show that things are not as necessary as they seem. As Foucault remarked, it wasn't as a matter of course that mad people came to be regarded as mentally ill. It wasn't self-evident that the only thing to be done with the criminal was to lock him up, and it wasn't self-evident that the causes of illness were to be sought through the examination of individual bodies. No one is a criminal, but many people are criminalized. No one has a race or a disability, but people are racialized and disabled. No one is a vulnerable, to use Eva Katay's term, but many people, including elders, disabled people, and prisoners, are made vulnerable, that is, are vulnerabilized. Even well-kept, adequately staffed nursing homes and so-called long-term care facilities cannot be the proper response to the question of how societies should provide to elders and younger disabled people. Such apparently genteel institutions should rather be recognized as the window dressing of the nursing home industrial complex, which is a carceral network of power that contributes to the reproduction of ableism, ageism, and racism, while underwriting a neoliberal political and social environment in which productivity and profit are steadily prioritized. Indeed, a comment that Roberts recently made about the futility of care ethics for work on prisons and so-called foster care also captures the futility of a care ethics approach to nursing homes and other institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are placed. As Roberts puts it, and I quote, "You can't fix prisons or so-called foster care by training their agents to be more caring. The very logic and design of these systems are antithetical to care," end quote. Likewise, the eugenic logic of neoliberalism, which provides the impetus for the nursing home industrial complex, makes a mockery of care. We should thus regard upscaled regulation and renovation of nursing homes and other institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are confined as a kind of gentrification of apparatuses of power. Gentrification designed in part to ease the minds of the community at large about the segregation and dehumanization that these institutions facilitate. In other words, gentrification that effectively expands the scope of these apparatuses of power and the systemic injustices that they both constitute and reproduce. The end. Thank you very much.